What if I told you that one speech, just 473 words, delivered by a black American congresswoman at a summit in Berlin, made a president in Africa break down in tears and within days sparked a global movement that's now challenging the entire way the world talks about power, aid, and dignity? This isn't fiction. This is the moment the world was forced to listen and everything changed. Stay with me, because you need to hear what she said and what happened next. Dear friends, what you're about to hear is more than just a story. It's a glimpse into a world where quiet courage reshapes destinies and dignity outshines power. These are the voices often missed by the headlines, but not here. If this kind of storytelling moves you, if it stays with you long after the screen fades, we invite you to subscribe and ring the bell. And before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. We read every word. Now let's begin. It didn't begin with a headline. It didn't start with war, famine, or scandal. It began with a woman standing alone in a hall full of world leaders, her voice low, her eyes locked not on the delegates, but on the camera, on us. Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman from the United States, stepped up to the podium at the Global Unity Forum in Berlin. The room was buzzing with half-listened speeches and muted translation headsets, but in less than 30 seconds, everything stopped. The murmurs faded, the whispers vanished. Delegates looked up, confused, then transfixed. Her words were not loud. There was no raised fist, no slogan, no demand, just clarity, so piercing it felt like a knife gliding through generations of silence. Africa does not need rescuing, she began. It needs recognition. No one clapped. No one moved. At that exact moment, thousands of miles away, in a modest presidential office in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward over his desk. He had been reviewing village water pipeline schematics, pen in hand, his mind cluttered with charts and approvals. But when his communications advisor burst in, breathless, eyes wide, simply saying, "Sir, you need to see this," he knew it wasn't politics as usual. As the live stream buffered on the small tablet before him, Traoré saw her face frozen mid-sentence. Jasmine, calm, poised, not begging, not branding, speaking like someone who had nothing to gain and everything to give, a woman from the very nation that had long dictated the narratives about his own continent. And somehow she was telling the truth he'd buried in policy briefs, in polite interviews, in conference panels where he'd been applauded, but never heard. Then she continued, "For too long, Africa has been described as a problem, but the real tragedy is not what it lacks. It's how much of its brilliance the world refuses to see." Traoré's pen slipped from his hand. It was a quiet sound, the pen hitting wood. But to him it echoed like thunder, because he had said those very words in private, in frustration, in loneliness. And now someone else, someone with a microphone that mattered, had dared to say them out loud. The president did not blink. He did not move, but tears began to fall, silent, unstoppable. And just like that, a speech that lasted less than 10 minutes cracked open a silence the world had gotten far too comfortable with. What did Jasmine Crockett say that made a nation weep, a president break down, and an entire global order shift its gaze? Keep listening, because this story is only just beginning. The morning had started like any other. In his office overlooking the sunlit rooftops of Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré sat surrounded by scattered reports, progress sheets from rural cooperatives, updates on an irrigation initiative in the arid north, and a hand-drawn proposal from teenage inventors in Bobo-Dioulasso for a solar-powered water purification system. His country, though often unseen by the outside world, was pulsing with ideas. Real work. Real change. But today, as usual, None of that would make headlines. His fingers traced the map pinned to his desk, a drone delivery route he'd personally helped design to transport medicine to isolated villages near Timbuktu. It was the kind of quiet victory that meant everything to the people and nothing to the cameras. He sighed, deep in thought, not out of exhaustion, but from that persistent ache he had come to know too well, the ache of invisibility. Traoré had led a revolution not just of power, but of dignity. He had traded spectacle for substance, grandeur for grit. And yet, the global stage still addressed him with thinly veiled condescension, aid with strings, conferences with hollow promises, handshakes that ended at the wrist. He had been called brave, ambitious, even idealistic, but rarely equal, and never truly heard. That was when Lena Kayla entered, the calm, composed strategist who rarely let emotion cross her face. Today her expression was unreadable, but her hands trembled slightly as she held out a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." Traoré didn't ask questions. He simply reached for the device. There, frozen on the screen, was Jasmine Crockett. He didn't know her, not personally. But something about her posture, the stillness, the fire behind her eyes, spoke louder than introductions ever could. He pressed play. The words poured out not as a performance, but as a reckoning. By the time the video ended, Traoré was no longer looking at a screen. He was staring at the unspoken truth of his life, finally spoken by someone oceans away. He didn't weep because he was moved. He wept because he had been carrying that truth alone for far too long. And now someone else was carrying it too. In the hours that followed the speech, a quiet storm began to brew, not on the news, not in headlines, but in the spaces between silences. President Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless in his office long after the screen had gone dark. Outside, the city of Ouagadougou moved as it always did, sunlight washing over markets, students laughing on motorbikes, women carrying baskets balanced with quiet strength. But inside the presidential compound, something had shifted. He didn't summon his advisors, he didn't call a press briefing. Instead, he stood up, walked to the corner of the room where a private terminal was housed, and asked for one thing: "Connect me with her." The staff hesitated. "Do you mean the Congresswoman?" He nodded once. "Jasmine Crockett." Thousands of miles away, Jasmine was back in Washington, her feet barely touching the ground since stepping off the plane. Her phone hadn't stopped vibrating. Media requests, thank yous, backlash. Some called her brave, others reckless. A cable news anchor had just questioned her patriotism, but none of that mattered to her. She hadn't expected the truth to go viral. She hadn't spoken for applause. She had spoken because silence was no longer bearable. That's when her aide, Rico, knocked gently. "Congresswoman, the president of Burkina Faso is requesting a private call. He says it's urgent." She looked up, not surprised exactly, but stilled. She closed her laptop, brushed the hair from her face, and nodded. Minutes later, two screens flickered to life, one in a modest office in West Africa, the other in the heart of Capitol Hill. There were no flags, no scripted opening lines, just two faces staring at each other through a crack in the world's noise. "Madame Congresswoman," Traoré began, his voice steady. "Your words, they didn't just reach us, they freed something." Jasmine blinked, unsure how to receive praise for something she didn't feel was hers to own. "Mr. President," she said gently, "I didn't speak for you. I echoed you." There was a pause, a silence too full for words. Traoré leaned back slowly. "Then maybe the world finally heard me, because you were the one holding the microphone." From that moment, they did not speak as strangers. They spoke as co-authors of a truth long suppressed. They talked not about what was broken, but what had always been beautiful, unnoticed, unheard, but alive. That night, they conceived something neither had prepared for, yet both had longed for. A space, a movement, a bridge, the global truth exchange. Not a foundation, not a brand, but a living network, connecting villages to policy rooms, student inventors to global stage lights, and local wisdom to global understanding. No more pity, no more permission, just voices, finally in harmony. And in that call, across oceans, the real story began. The plane began its descent over the rust-colored earth of Burkina Faso, and Jasmine Crockett pressed her forehead lightly against the window. She had traveled to dozens of countries as a politician, a speaker, a guest, but this time felt different. This time, she wasn't arriving as a representative of power. She was arriving because someone had listened, and more importantly, because she had listened back. As the wheels touched down, she saw them, crowds lining the streets beyond the small airstrip. Not official banners or choreographed parades, not handshakes and red carpets, just people, thousands of them standing shoulder to shoulder under the brutal sun, holding signs made from whatever they had, old cardboard, sewn cloth, hand-painted wood. One read, "Truth is welcome here." Another, "You echoed us." There were no chants, no shouting, just applause that rose like a prayer, full and alive. President Ibrahim Traoré waited at the front, not flanked by armed guards, but by two schoolchildren holding solar lanterns. He wore traditional indigo robes, dignified without pretense, with a quiet pride that seemed to radiate from the soil beneath his feet. As Jasmine stepped off the final stair of the aircraft, their eyes met. There were no speeches, no formalities, only a handshake that said everything neither language nor politics could express. But Jasmine hadn't come to be praised. She had come to see the soul of the country she had unknowingly spoken for. The journey began immediately, no luxury cars or rehearsed schedules. She asked for something simple. "Take me where the work is happening." In the village of Kudugu, she met Adja, a young woman who had lost her sight as a child but went on to become the lead developer of an audio-based learning app for rural schools. In a tin-roofed tech hub run by Generator, Adja explained how children with disabilities were finally able to study without needing to leave their villages. Later, in the graffiti-washed alleys of Banfora, Jasmine met Eli, a teenage artist who was turning street walls into living classrooms by embedding QR codes into his murals. One scan brought up lessons in agriculture, water filtration, or poetry, depending on the image. "If the world won't give us libraries," he said with a grin, "we'll build them with paint." But what struck Jasmine most was not the innovation, it was the humility. The way every story began, not with "look what I did," but with "look what we tried." Under the branches of mango trees, in circles of school children and elders, she listened. And what she heard was not desperation, it was design, it was strategy, it was brilliance born of necessity and nourished by love. In each face, she saw not people waiting to be saved, but architects of their own futures, and for the first time in her public life, Jasmine felt what it meant to not lead, but to follow. Beneath the great baobab tree in the village of Boromo, time seemed to pause. Its gnarled branches stretched like ancient arms above the gathering, a place where stories had been traded for generations. Today, it bore witness to something new, not a conference, not a summit, but a convergence. Farmers with calloused hands sat beside university students. Children fidgeted on woven mats. Elders leaned in, not to advise, but to listen. There were no microphones, only voices, no banners, only presence. Jasmine Crockett sat beside President Ibrahim Traoré on a wooden bench, polished smooth by age and conversation. She looked different now. No political badge, no podium stance, just a simple dress sewn by a local seamstress and a notebook in her lap. Traoré, too, had shed all symbols of office. Today he was not a president. He was a man listening to his people speak for themselves. One by one they came forward. A teenage girl named Mariam, holding a homemade water pump valve she had engineered from discarded bicycle parts. An elder named Bakari, who had organized a reading circle under a tree during the civil unrest years ago. Each story humble, each solution profound. Then Aminata, the small girl with a voice barely louder than a whisper, stepped forward. In her hands a folded paper. She had written a poem. Not for applause, but because she believed it mattered. "The world didn't save us," she read. "We reminded it how to see." The stillness afterward was more powerful than any ovation. When Jasmine finally stood, her voice trembled not from fear, but from knowing the weight of what was happening. "You were never behind," she said softly. "The world was simply facing the wrong way." Traoré joined her. His words were slow, deliberate. No more silence disguised as peace, no more applause without action. They announced what had been quietly forming for weeks. The Global Truth Exchange would expand into annual regional festivals, where innovation, art, and local leadership would take center stage. No gatekeepers, no approvals, just dignity. As the crowd rose, not in protocol, but in shared recognition, Jasmine looked around and saw not an audience, but a movement. It hadn't started with her, and it would not end with them. Because the truth, once spoken, doesn't sleep. It travels, it builds, and it stays. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Jasmine Crockett is not one of politics or charity. It is the story of recognition of what happens when truth is no longer whispered but boldly spoken aloud, when dignity is no longer begged for but declared as already owned. It began with a moment, one woman standing at a podium in Berlin, unshaken and clear, delivering words the world had long refused to hear. It sparked something that couldn't be undone, a ripple through power structures, borders, and narratives that had long silenced an entire continent's voice. President Traoré didn't cry because he was moved by pity. He cried because, for once, someone outside his soil had echoed the truth he had carried alone for years. His tears weren't weakness, they were release. And from that release came resolve. What followed wasn't just symbolic, it was deeply human. Jasmine didn't fly in to deliver aid or promises. She came to listen, to witness, and in doing so she helped ignite a flame that had always been there, burning quietly in the hands of youth, elders, farmers, creators. From tech hubs in remote villages to poems whispered beneath mango trees, a movement was born. The Global Truth Exchange wasn't designed in a boardroom. It was breathed into life by people who had never needed permission to be brilliant, only acknowledgement. And from that seed grew something even more powerful, a shared purpose that transcended identity, geography, and history. This story teaches us that dignity is not granted by power. It is revealed when someone dares to see clearly, to speak honestly, and to listen deeply. In a world distracted by noise, these two voices, Traoré's and Jasmine's, cut through with clarity. Their story reminds us that change doesn't always begin with action. Sometimes it begins with being seen. So what can we take away from this? In your own life, think about who isn't being heard, whose truth is being overlooked, whether it's in your community, your workplace, or even your own family. What might happen if you chose to listen deeper, speak braver, and treat dignity not as a reward, but as a right? Here's a question for you to reflect on and answer in the comments. Who truly started the movement known as the Global Truth Exchange? A. Jasmine Crockett. B. The people of Burkina Faso. Type A or B in the comments. Also, what do you think about this story? What part moved you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonates with you. And if this message touched something in you, hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life. Let's keep building a world where voices matter and truth is never silenced.